Hi, today's April 21st, 2023, and I'm honored to have with me Mark Changizi. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey, your accomplishments?
Hey there, great to be here, Randall. Well, I mean, a short background. I'm a physics math kid, physics math undergrad, which I did to answer the questions of the universe, which has always been my aim to life. And then went on for a PhD in math. And still the idea was to do all of that stuff, not because I was per se interested in math, which is sort of just a bunch of tautologies and vacuous truths, but those are the tools that you need to study consciousness and why all these creatures have why we have the most intelligent, interesting creatures in biological design and culture and a lot of the really fun, wispy stuff. But I needed to have a firm, rigorous foundation in computer science, theory of computation, mathematical logic, and mathematics, as well as physics. In fact, even my high school essay describes it as such. I'm going to go on to get physics, math, computer science, so that I can one day answer the question of the universe, including I never did work on consciousness. I think it's a pseudo problem. There's kind of a category mistake of some kind. But anyway, that's what I was saying back in high school. And so that's really I'm really more of like a philosopher scientist. My heroes were, Quine and Carnap and Hilary Putnam and Bertrand Russell, Turing and von Neumann, these sorts of folks, which went from field to field and were able to make impacts in part because they were not constrained to one field, and in part because they had these wide-ranging, rigorous tools at their disposal. And so that's the kind of person that I've always tried to aim, the sorts of folks that I've tried to be inspired by.
Well, that's excellent. So I consider that a Renaissance man. I have had similar aspirations. We come up in slightly different eras. But I was a chemistry and physics major. I'm a physician. And so, I've kind of felt as if I've at least understood some aspects of the physical underpinnings of the logic, the science, the mathematics behind groupings and aggregations and the universe and molecules and so forth. But also you have to understand human interactions. You can understand the molecule very well and still not get somebody's personality disorder, and the latter might affect your life more than the former, especially if you get into altercation and so forth. The one question I have, I read some Bertrand Russell in college, and I was an admirer because he was a physicist, and I thought he was, spouting interesting things at the time, but I was young. I'm not as much of a Bertrand Russell fan now, and I also wonder about the possible, what I call the Linus Pauling exception to the Renaissance man aspect, which is, he was a double Nobel Prize winner, I think, in medicine and in chemistry, if I'm not mistaken. But then he did this vitamin C thing. He's kind of like, got ahead of his skis and or bowling in the wrong lane or whatever. And I think there are some issues we see where people expand their expertise beyond their own areas. And we were mentioning a little bit of Neil deGrasse Tyson and kind of his science background, whether it really applied to the epidemic, for instance, and whether there's miscategorization, what you call a category error or category mistake in applying consensus to science, because in this realm more social. Anyway, that's kind of a packed, loaded question, but maybe we could start with any aspect of that, whether you want to touch on Neil deGrasse Tyson or any of the other things I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, so what you're pointing to is this idea that Neil deGrasse Tyson, for those that didn't see it, was on a show that I didn't really know well. A lot of people know the show, and I can't remember the show's name. But he was being, pushed. Like, why were you arguing and trying to shut down opposing points of view about various aspects of the interventions? And he just kept responding, well, there was the consensus of the experts. It was the expert consensus, and there's a number of steps wrong with this. First of all, we can't even presume that he had any consensus, because he's, of course, sitting in a groupthink. And so, of course, all the folks that he was connected to in his sort of collective hysteria that got going in March of 2020, of course, they all typically believe that. He was part of that very network. So his own sampling of what amounts to consensus is almost a tautology that it's going to seem like consensus, because he's not reaching out of his groupthink. Secondly, even if there was consensus, it's a terrible argument. If you start to favor positions or amplify positions that are consensus and de-amplify or censor non-consensus viewpoints, that just creates a positive feedback loop, where if you've got 50.1% consensus, then that gives you some small reason to push down, the anti-consensus and to raise the consensus. And then you're at 50.5%, which gives you even more reason and so forth. So this snowballs into a full 100% groupthink. So that's a terrible idea. And of course, we can go through lots of examples. And as a scientist, I'm good at overturning consensus. That's, all of my discoveries are, in fact, I usually only aimed for a field where I thought, they're all wrong. And it's only fun to do this because they're wrong.
Absolutely. Well, sorry to break in, but literally that's the title of my book. We'll get to this later, but my book is Overturning Zika. And Zika microcephaly is science, as it were, and it's a $1 billion industry and research and all that kind of stuff, and everyone knows it's real. The CDC, the WHO, they got pamphlets, they keep warning women, blah blah blah, but it hasn't recurred as microcephaly. Zika is real, and microcephaly is a real thing. So those are two real things, but there are real things in my room. There's a flashlight over there, and there's a tennis racket over there, but the flashlight doesn't have any impact on the tennis racket. They're both real. That one has nothing to do with the other.
Right.
And so literally that is the title of my book. I played with a number of different titles, but overturning is one of those fun things. Debunking, probably a clunkier word, but that is kind of my personal chew toy. As people around me know, it's like you have to kind of put things through a couple different lenses and prisms in order to figure out what it is. And you're absolutely right about the consensus fallacy. Especially you had an article which I'm going to like to touch on where you channel Václav Havel, the former dissident, then fortunately president of Czechoslovakia at the time. Now it's Czechia and where, but he couldn't have been president if he hadn't been the dissident, and he couldn't have been president of anything under the Soviets if he hadn't helped break the Soviets. And there was a Prague Spring, but then it became right after that they went backwards into winter before they got summer. And so this concept of in the Soviet and totalitarian thought is that you can't have things that are outside the consensus. And we've arrived at this concept. Newton was outside the consensus. Einstein was outside the consensus. Any good Jesus, frankly, was outside the consensus. And that doesn't mean you have a nice easy life out of it. Socrates died being out of the consensus, and so forth. And hopefully we all martyrdom sounds great in a way, a few hundred years from now, but none of us in the moment want to be martyred by it. And certainly some of us have. So there's been this kind of totalitarian aspect. I'm wondering what your experience has been, these last few years of a term that was only used in prison, lockdowns, applied to society of ostensibly entirely healthy people aside from the few affected.
Yeah. Well, I just want to, in terms of consensus, just before we leave that, we're not really ever leaving that, and it's all wrapped up in this mainstream narrative that got developed in March of 2020. But there is an intuition that consensus taps into, which is right, and that intuition is that we have a mistaken thought. Well, let's say there's 100 scientists in the field, and if they were independent scientists, like sitting in their own lab on some island, never having communicated with anybody else, and 99 out of the 100 all came to some particular conclusion independently. Now you've got a really statistically independent sample, right? That would be actually data of some kind. These were but of course that's never the case. So they're mistakenly imagining this consensus is like typical random, independent data. And it's not at all like that. It's just as likely to be. It's basically one big data point, and it just happens to be a big one, but it's still one little dot on the page. And yeah, how does this all connect? So we'll get back to mainstream narratives and narratives and what they mean and how they don't go away and how this connects to totalitarianism and to lockdowns. But indeed, in March 10th was my first tweet, and I could already tell something was way off. We were heading down into mass hysteria, which was I was hinting at that first day. Like there's the IFR doesn't seem to. I didn't even know the difference between infection fatality rate and case fatality rate at that rate. I hadn't quite cottoned on to this, but I could tell whatever numbers they're saying are going to be so much higher than the real numbers because they're only getting the folks that are showing up at the hospital. That means there's tons and tons of cases that no one's measured in terms of the denominator. And so I was just I was putting out publications like this. In fact, I was able at that time to cite BBC and ABC News, and they had not gone overboard. They were just actually publishing actual numbers that were calming. But a few, even a week later, things had really flipped. And at that point, Business Insider was publishing side by sides of flu and COVID, but it was flu infection fatality rate with little bars, beep, beep, like just little bars as a function of demographics, and then case fatality rate, which is the chances of you dying if you've already showed up to the hospital for COVID. And so these numbers are like really big, kind of, and then little teeny numbers down here. But they're comparing apples and oranges, right? They're totally different things. And so you've got a 10, 20 factor difference. And so this was what was even presented in the Senate hearings on March 11th, right? So these things spread throughout the culture. Within, the average person on the street thought that 9% of the United States population was dead by summer. The average respondent actually estimated that 9% of the population was already dead of COVID.
Well, they might have meant brain dead, but
yeah, the average respondent in Australia thought that the infection fatality rate was 38%. Right.
Right.
It's not 3.8%. It's not even 0.38%. Right.
Yep.
It's like 0.09% if you're 70 or under. Right. So it was astronomical over exaggerations of the harms, a complete zeroing out of all of the knowledge that we have of respiratory viruses, which I was really coming to know. I always thought this was the most boring field ever. I wasn't interested per se, but everything that we knew about respiratory viruses and seasonality and acquired immunity, all of these things, because it was entirely novel, all of the prior probabilities, which would have been, like all things equal, we should expect it to be kind of like this because it's not the only coronavirus. So it should be like the other ones and other.
Right.
But no, all of that is like, no, we know nothing about this. So we have to start learning from scratch, right?
Oh, it's crazy. It was crazy. I started this podcast, videocast, whatever, by myself. I was just, I had a lot of my Facebook. I've got, a few thousand Facebook friends and whatnot. And they're like, we want to hear your thoughts. And I'm like, well, I don't know if my thought anyway. So I started this thing and I was mostly, whistling in the wind. And I was frustrated because the groups around me were all shouting me down for contrary ideas. Kind of that their consensus was that I was wrong and wretched and so forth. But anyway, it's been kind of a weird journey, ultimately to be right, but to have been shouted down the whole time. Has that, kind of impinged your life? And as far as your work, the what you're pointing out with that single data point is I think highly accurate. And in my field, I came upon Zika before COVID. And I tried to work up a small piece on it, and it wouldn't get published anywhere. There's kind of a consolidation, a congealing, a constipation of thought and action, which basically centers around the fact that the funding comes from one place. And we saw that, just as a side note, with the Fauci Collins memos that are now being uncovered about quashing doctors Bhattacharya, Gupta, and Martin Kulldorff, and probably others, about getting any contrary message. And so, you're absolutely right. My other work, I wrote on the Omicron phenomenon and the fact that we still call it COVID-19. It's not COVID-19 at all. It's, Corona 22 or whatever. And people have no thought and knowledge of the fact that coronavirus has been around longer than humans. And it's always been, for I don't know how many years, probably thousands or 100,000 years, been, one of the major sources of the common cold. Nobody ever mentions that. And then Omicron is frankly probably just a common cold and just another coronavirus. We happen to have a test for it now. So there's all this kind of factitious stuff and fallacious and cherry picking the kind of narratives and data you want to pick, just to make the way you mentioned the case fatality rate versus the infection fatality rate. Even defining what a case is was misused in one way or another. In medicine, a case of pneumonia is you have pneumonia. A case of COVID was you turned positive for a test, and that you could be completely asymptomatic. You'd have coincident coronavirus, false negatives, false positive, and or some other coronavirus, which are extant in the population about probably 5-10% of the time anyway, and ignoring the blatant data of the Diamond Princess, which was sitting out in Yokohama Harbor for a quarantine period. And the data was completely benign, and Fauci knew about it. He actually quoted it in February. But there was this kind of turning point early on in 2020 where we had to, as Donald McNeil in the New York Times, the erstwhile chief science writer, global health reporter, announced we had to go medieval on it, and why we had to do that, and why we had to adopt the ethos of the CCP in locking people down, and I mean it's just it boggles the mind. I don't understand what was the motivation. We may never, but it wasn't good, we keep kind of circling back to the Soviet theme, but there are aspects of the clamping down of free speech, the uniform consensus opinions becoming science, the way people are locked down and treated like chattel. It's all very scary stuff. Anyway, that's not a question, but let me just ask a question, which is, what informs your sensibilities, and what gave you the kind of the impetus to be, a voice, and how did you diverge from some of your other work to concentrate on the COVID aspects?
I mean, yeah, I suppose I could argue that there's two aspects of it. One, as an evolutionary biologist, mathematician type, I deal with emergent phenomena all the time. So the idea of seeing these kinds of mass effects and collective hysteria, we're just always looking for these sorts of things, and all the hallmarks of it in March 10 and beyond of 2020. Also, though, I think I never considered this to be something that I was part of my science per se, but more about my attitude towards how to be a good scientist. And I used to write things for my students about how to be aloof. And, as a good theorist, or trying to be a good theorist, it was important because when you're an academic, it's easy to get caught up in some particular academic field. You show up to their academic conferences. You want to be like Judy and Doug, and they're gray a little bit, and they're like the super famous people in this small fishbowl. And then by the time you're mid-30s, you've done a few things, and people are starting to pay respect to you. The young men are like, sir, and the lady batting their eyes, and you kind of like that. And you suddenly only care about the problems in that field and the positions within that field, and you want to rise socially in that field. And all the problems in those other fields, they work on ridiculously stupid problems, and you all make fun of their problems. It's like the New York City maps. Sometimes they make these New York City maps, which is the whole Earth filled up 98% with New York or Manhattan even.
Yeah,
and
Saul Steinberg.
Right, and the rest is just sort of dust on the outside, because that's what happens to you intellectually. So I always knew that we end up with these little group things already just socially. And I said I need to avoid that, because in order to get a new theoretical, big, grand unifying theory, I'm not going to do it again in the same field I just was. I got to move on. And the only way you're going to move on if you don't get glued to it, because you're not even going to realize you got glued to it, right? You're just going to get stuck to it without realizing and not being aware. So I've always had this kind of awareness, but I wasn't really doing it for political reasons. I was doing it for science reasons. So it was a combination of those sorts of things where I really saw that this was a strange phenomenon going on in March. And the first time it really hit me over the head was when my CrossFit friends, we were all working out outside because we couldn't work out at the gym. And some lady, 50s, stopped in her car, ran at us, say, "Who are you guys? Why are you working out together? What gym are you guys coming from?" And she was aggressive snitch on the street, right? And you could kind of laugh because here we are, these strong people, and she's not, and who would you? But no, this is dangerous. You get this times 100,000, not to mention times 100 million, right? That's all that you need for totalitarianism, because authoritarianism is one thing, but you end up with authoritarianism and tin pot banana republics where each month there's a new dictator of the month, and everybody in the street just goes, and they do their own thing, right? They can't convey their power everywhere. What's dangerous is when you end up with distributed, decentralized authoritarianism. That's what makes totalitarianism, and only happens when there's buy-in by virtue of like a righteous new narrative or righteous new religion that's spread through the whole culture, and it's coming up bottom up just as often as it comes up bottom up, and they're the ones who swept in the new leader on their backs, right? It's those are the dangerous ones, because then it's your children and your cousins and your workmates and everybody and your neighbors who are snitching on you, saying, "Oh, he had more than 5 people over at his house." Yep. You're not allowed to have that many.
Absolutely, that happened. And I think I first of all, I want to give you props for pointing out the difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Jean Kirkpatrick, she was the one of the ambassadors to the UN, brilliant woman. She had an essay on this probably 40 years ago, and politics wasn't my gig, and it's still not my gig, but I really was interested in this because she pointed out that Franco in Spain was an authoritarian, and probably Allende in Chile was an authoritarian. Um, Mao was a totalitarian, and all the Kims, various Kims in North Korea are totalitarians. What is the difference? In short, basically, I think it's the co-optation of religion as the state. The only thing you can worship in totalitarianism is the state and the message of the state. Authoritarianism, Franco allows the church to be there. Allende allows the church to be there, and you can have a place in the solace, and you're not, all your beliefs are not centered on the divinity of the state. So one is, and plus one is easier from which to exit than the other. So authoritarian regimes can flip. So Franco gets old, dies, whatever, and then there was an underlying royalty which he didn't get rid of either. They get to take over, and totalitarian regimes, they hang around forever. They can only rupture, and so the Soviet ruptured, and along with that, the various parts of East Europe, and your Václav Havel piece, I think, really talks about this concept of totalitarianism, and clearly still, as shaky and rickety and famine-inducing as North Korea has been for its own people, it's still there. And if you ran a business as crappy as that, you wouldn't be. So there's a kind of they have to own your thought, and your religion has to be them.
But the key, what allows them to do that is that it's almost not just top-down forces being pushed down from the top. Of course, there is that too. They're trying to maintain this, but often the leader can flip away. They could be gone. Just somebody else is going to fill that spot, and he or she is going to also be pushed by the same righteous narrative, which drives all society forward, because it's being driven by everybody at all levels. In some sense, it's really dominating everything. They often have almost no choice. The new leader is just like the old leader, and so it's a very different kind of glue. It's a social narrative glue that's permeated society, and it's a completely different kind of phenomenon than authoritarianism. And so that's what I've devoted. So I mean, in 2021, I started a research institute called the Free Expression Institute, or freex.group, and the idea is to study free expression, freedom, collective hysteria, these kinds of psychosocial forces that are the things that lead to totalitarianism and democides and genocides and minor and major ones. I mean, my family comes from Iran, and this is an everyday thing. My wife is from Iran. My father is from Iran. And we never really, we as in you and I from America, never experienced it. I was born in America. We just think that it's, Islamic types that deal with this kind of stuff, and Chinese and Germans, and they're pretty strict and stringent. So that would only happen to the Germans, not other people, right? We say bullshit like this all the time, right? I mean, it's totally, part of us knows it's not right, but I think part of it's still sort of like, well, that's just because, right? No, those are the same psychosocial forces with different icing. And now for the first time, we in the West, outside of Germany, experience it. We really saw it, right? And so we really need to understand it, research it. And then a lot of folks on my side, on the anti-lockdown side, still don't see it. They still see that this was all grand master plan by Gates and the WHO and Klaus Schwab, and they don't think in terms of the collective dynamics that really is.
Right. I mean, so you're saying it's not just co-optation; it's adoption. People it has to be. It can rain in the desert, but the water doesn't take. The ground's too hard. So what you need in order to grow, say, the totalitarianism, you're saying that you need a little bit of an accepting soil for the raining rain from those who want to reign over us, in either sense of the word. They need to have something that is receptive. So if people don't buy in, you don't get it.
Right. And that's still kind of more one-dimensional than unidirectional than I'd like to say, because very often in a lot of these, even in the CCP, and let's start with Boris Johnson. Initially, he was pushing back, saying, we got to go for herd immunity. None of these interventions are going to work. A week later, there was so much pressure bottom up. It's from both the regular folks in the street as well as unions and all kinds of other forces pressuring in a bottom-up way him to do it. And even in the CCP, Ben Irvine is one of these people that have been arguing, look, originally the CCP in February or January and February was saying, no, we don't want to freeze the economy and do lockdowns. And I can imagine they actually didn't want to be. running an economy in a master planned way, which they semi kind of do, and pausing it. In fact, some of the first compadres anti-lockdown that I found in March before I met all of the wider folks were communists, capital C communists, who knew you can't freeze an economy. They're really sensitive about this, right? They ought to be sensitive about it. Like, no, you can't go free. And so the CCP originally didn't want to, but there's a backstory where the populists they sort of got themselves all into a fright, and they don't trust the government for good reason. So finally the government said, okay, we have to look like we're leading. And so they went out and led hard with lockdowns to look like they were in charge. Same thing happened in countries across the world. And a lot of it was copycatting other countries, and a lot of it was bottom-up forces. And it was, Sweden, only because Tegnell was particularly strong and their constitution prevents certain kinds of things, that he was able to hold on. But there was so much bottom-up pressure trying to make them lock down. So it's both that the populace has to be wanting it, but often the populace is itself forcing it, pushing it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing. I think it's a little bit like kind of the U drain in a toilet. If you, I'm sure you know the hydrodynamic concepts. Pressure comes here, and then it kind of pushes the pressure up somewhere else. So I think it might be bottom up to a certain extent, but I think the bottom up part is people getting things from the top, and I'm always amazed that humans can accomplish so much individually and so much technologically, but we are wired as animals, and probably a tribal animal, and our natural milieu say that for thousands of years was tribes, and not everyone's supposed to lead the tribe, and a lot of people are going to find, we look at fish and we think they're brainless, and maybe relatively speaking they are, and they school. So, if you're, snorkeling, whatever, you'll see that, one fish, boom, I don't know how they decide all to go the other direction, but they do. And now and then, boom, they're all back. And they do it like with the blink of an eye. I'm sure not sure whether their eyes blink, but with one of mine, and boom. And so it's a funny term for me. That's this schooling. They call it schooling of fish. I don't know why, but this is an interesting coincidence, because we school, but we tend to school boom, like that. We all think, this, and then 5 minutes later we all think that. I mean, if you had brought the concept today of kind of this castration or surgical excisions, mastectomies for minors 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I think let alone 20 or 30, whatever, when I went to medical school 100 years ago, you'd be laughed out. I mean, it would be ludicrous, but then the medical academy schools, and it's a little bit, to give Mr. Tyson his due. He's right about that in science, that people will act on consensus. And again, why they do it, whether it's the funding thing, down, or looking at your peers and wanting to school and not be outside the group. I think there's a reasonable aspect that if you're in a herd of deer, you don't want to be that one deer that's hanging around gets eaten. You'll have your power, and a bunch of antlers can face out, kind of like the wagon trains or whatever. You can circle and whatnot. So there's protective aspect, and I think most of what we've seen through this is that one of our big motivators, leaving outside gamma rays and physics and all that kind of is fear, is basic fear, and that's a huge tool. Archimedes said, getting back to physics, give me a lever big enough and I can move the world. Well, he didn't need it. He just needed to access people's fear.
Yeah, well, I mean, but it's one thing to make a herd afraid. It's another thing to direct it. Often they're going to do highly coordinated things, but you're not the one coordinating them, right? So this is, one intuition a lot of folks that are the more master planner types say, how could you end up with all this seeming coordination? And you can point to tons of seeming coordination, right? How they all, did the same lockdowns within the same week or so. How could it all be coordinated in this way if it's not a master planner? But seeming coordination is what you get for free. It is the standard example of what happens in emergent complex phenomena. Schools of fish are highly seemingly coordinated, and they are coordinated, but there's that seemingly in the sense of seemingly master coordinated, not right. It happens through these emergent phenomena, and we have our intuitions for emergent phenomena like this are as bad as they are for quantum mechanics. They're terrible, right? We're really bad at thinking about these things. When we want a causal explanation for something, we want it to be a typical everyday world, where it's billiard ball like A causes B causes C, and that's just how you make sense of emergent phenomena. And so people are really bad at it. So that's a lot of my time is trying to make sure people understand the moral. Because if you get the moral of this wrong, then you're going to attribute all of the evil that happened. One, you're going to only blame just a few gals and guys at the top, and you're going to miss a lot of those folks. They excuse, Trump has his own culpability in this. He was the guy in charge, right, when all of this happened. And there's lots of leaders, world leaders, that say, well, they were lied to by these puppeteers, so we really shouldn't blame them. And I'm hearing them say this all the time. It's all just the blame. Like, no, there's leaders at all these levels, all the way down to your county and city, that participated in this. And they are all culpable, and you're going to excuse all of them on the idea that there were these witches or demons that coordinated everything, and only they're responsible. Two, not only are you going to miss the right people, but you're going to you're not going to learn how to stop the next one, because this is always going to be with us. These psychosocial forces, these tendencies towards tyranny, fascism, and tyranny will happen again and again, each time feeling a little different. And you're not going to recognize it as the same thing because it has different icing. And you're going to fail to try to come up with ways, okay, how can we restructure social networks or do something that it can inhibit these so that they aren't, or have stronger civil liberties, constraints, or, preventing emergency power, all kinds of things that have to be on the table to figure out how to stop these. But if you don't think it's about collective hysteria and it's just about those particular villains who master planet, then you're not going to be aiming to do any of that, right? So that's what, that's my aim for FreeX is really trying to get folks to get it, both sides to get it. Because I think right now, of course, those that fell into lockdowner side are often still haven't woken up. They don't understand really what happened, that they were part of a mass hysteria, part of the totalitarian forces. It's really hard to explain that to them. But a lot of folks on my side really still don't get what they saw. They just want to find demons and just blame them.
Well, so what's the prophylaxis? My aunt is elderly, and she's in a nursing home now, and she votes, and like many in her cohort, she just turns on the TV, boom, and she listens to the talking heads and whatnot. People are, it would be great if people found your freex.group, and it would be great if they followed you on Twitter and so forth. But people, there's a, I think you're a bright guy, a very bright guy, and probably amongst the brightest. But the regular people are regular, and for every genius, there's somebody on the opposite side of the Gaussian curve, the standard distribution, and how does one get the mantle of persuasion and power in order to have the fish be schooled a little bit better? I mean, you can't teach the fish to go independently. That's not necessarily in their interest or their way. They're fish. What's the possibility here, and what has been your success, and what are your recommendations, I guess?
Yeah, I lost you for a little bit, but I think it managed to catch up. This is I would call the $1 trillion question. So I don't want to try to tell you that I have a nice pill that I can offer. That's but there's a whole lot of stuff, and I talk about this in 300 videos about different kinds of angles. But what I really want to first do is try to understand what these psychosocial forces are, how they work, and if we can much better understand how they work, then we're in a much better position to try to figure out the liberties that you can inhibit them in the future. So, for example, one of the things that we often talk about narratives in a very intuitive sense. There's this mainstream narrative, blah, blah, blah. And they have this tendency to not ever go away. Like they just continue to march forward. And in the case of the trans world and children, now the narrative is justifying things that were completely absurd even 5 years ago, much less 10, as you just mentioned, right? How is it that narratives do this? And this is what one of the things that I'm trying to understand. And one thing I just wanted to point out is that actually it is a lot of similarities to blockchain. Now, a lot of people may not know blockchain in detail, but the key thing that's similar is this. If I've got cryptocurrency, I've got some Bitcoin, and I want to send Randall Bitcoin, right? And so there is no central bank that's keeping track of where I sent my Bitcoin. So I could send Bitcoin to Randall, and then later I say, no, I never sent it to Randall, and I still have my coin. I want to go send Doug now some Bitcoin. We have to prevent that. So how do you prevent that when there's no central bank keeping track of who sent Bitcoin to who? And the way that blockchain does it, the whole idea behind cryptocurrency is that we have this distributed bank in some sense that's keeping records on everybody's computer everywhere, decentralized. And there's a certain notions of how you add new things that happened this week to the next week that are being glued on in this mathematical sense, which is really hard to do, but easy to recognize that you're the first person who did it. It's called proof of work. And there's also proof of stake. If I'm a big holder of cryptocurrency or of some kind, I may have a bigger vote as to whether that was the right new add-on, because I care about the value of that currency because I've got a lot. So I'm more likely to be truthful. Now, that creates a history, like a narrative, like a history of the tribe of all the reputation transactions that have happened. That's hard to go back and ever make a new history. Now, the same thing has to happen in social networks too. So in real life, if I'm a jerk to Randall and I say, Randall, you don't know what you're talking about all the time, and then it turns out I'm wrong, well, I'll lose reputation to you because I was humiliated. But if later I say, no, I never lost reputation to Randall, right? And the reason I can't do that is because the tribe remembers and has added it to the social blockchain and says, oh yeah, no, now it's in everybody's heads that Mark was a douchebag and lost reputation to Randall. And in fact, the way that it's added is very similar to both proof of stake and proof of work. Proof of work in the sense that good gossipers are the ones that tell a news story about what Mark did, consistent with his behavior and Randall's behavior and all the past history. And it's really hard to come up with sometimes a good explanation, but it's really easy to recognize, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? So it glues easily and has the needed properties that are proof of work like. And also the gossipers are often the higher reputation folks are the ones more likely to be listened to in terms of what really happened. This features are the features for why blockchain works and is an immutable history that you can't mess with. And that's what makes it a currency at all, so that people have it's preserved over time, and you really have it has the value that you have because no one can muck with it. But it's the same principles that underlie our reputation currency has value over time. But that same method of preserving reputation currency to make sure that I can't lie about mine and how rich I am versus you is what also makes these narratives, social narratives, unbreakable. Once they get going, you can't just go back and say the last 40 years was all wrong. It's almost impossible to do. It's really, really hard. And so they march on. And then sometimes, for example, masks, totally there's no reason to wear them in March and April. And then suddenly by May, everybody's totally has to wear them. The science changed. And so these are what this blockchain narrative is part of this, but also the evolution of new kinds of signals. So also then get incorporated into these narratives. So let me give you an example there. At first, no one wore masks. But by April, people that were more on the lockdown side, you might see a few here and there wearing a mask. It was a signal like, I take COVID seriously and I'm trying to do zero COVID and I care more than you, right? So they would wear that, even though the science didn't say to wear at that point. But it became a reliable a membership signal of being in the lockdown caring tribe.
I agree. Yep.
It wasn't yet justifiably helpful, but invariably when there's first membership signals, then the community will over time evolve. People will come up with good justifications for why it's not just a membership signal, it's also good to wear, good to do. It's good. And this happens all the time. Like even like in some cities, like there's one neighborhood where the ladies are rich and they all wear Lululemon to look like they're not trying, but they're trying. And other neighborhoods will wear dresses all the time when they go out. And they'll each make fun of the other for their different kinds of choices. And their own magazines will actually justify, well, Lululemons are really healthy for your skin. They let your skin breathe. And it's better for your man to not see you always, whatever. They'll come up with all bullshit stories justifying it that over time become part of the narrative, justifying the membership signals as virtuous themselves, right? They're actually good for you. And both sides do it. So this is not just happening for COVID. It's a very normal part of the process. Narratives in these movements evolve justifications, ethical and scientific justifications for the post hoc. They're post hoc justifying the membership signals they have and turning them into virtue signals, that they're genuinely virtuous. So it's much worse. Like you and your wife or whatever, someone in your life, you do something wrong and you're going to be thick-headed because you don't want to admit that you're wrong. And sometimes you can convince yourself that you were right, even though you're not. It's a trillion times worse when it's a movement, because these movements, it's the whole community of folks who are developing sophisticated, smart, ethical and scientific justifications for the post hoc, for the stuff that the community sort of just wiggled into.
Yep.
And of course it's right, because these are highly smart people, and it's a consensus because it's a whole lot of different people. Of course, it's all one thing. It's not.
No, it's great. It's right. I mean, people, the worst thing you can be now is a racist. And the central fact of the United States was slavery. Notwithstanding that slavery was, I think, in every country on earth at the time, probably, and the United States was one of the first, and through one of the most bloody mechanisms ever, the Civil War, the most fratricidal, near suicidal mechanisms. They got rid of slavery in advance of, say, Brazil and other places with far more slave traffic and numbers of slaves and so forth. But that's the central thing, and everyone here, is very much on their high horse over that, validly so. But conversely, if you were to go back to 1865 or consult Dostoevsky about the, validity of aborting a child, a baby within you, or to take away the, before the achievement of the age of majority, take away the progenitive features of an individual, reproductively, that would be child abuse, and on either sense. So people are completely acontextual about this, and amnestic, and historical, and silly. So you're making interesting points, about how we move, and we're kind of, maybe one big amoeba. Getting back to, we were mentioning beforehand about Carl Sagan and cosmos. There's kind of always this concept that, the atom looks like the solar system, if you look closely enough, and people are always drilling down into all these sci-fi stories that, when you look back, our universe is just one little molecule in some other universe and so forth. But there's there are ways in which we are kind of morphing like a cell, like a huge cell, and perhaps we have a lot more coordination now through Twitter and tech and internet and whatnot, to act as a cell. This is a scary proposition, because it's really the kind of the friction between cells and the competition between organisms that allows them to ultimately succeed within their environment. I think this is a Darwinian concept. Anyway, so again, that's another non-question. But is there anything there that interests you?
Well, no, that was great. No, I didn't have a follow-up to that. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to branch out to some of the things you do and some of the other pieces you have. I've been fascinated by looking at your books and whatnot. We are kind of rounding out the hour here, and you have my apologies for talking too much. I don't know. Maybe you can think about some medication for me later, but. I wanted to give people a chance to look at some of the breadth of your work. So let me see if I can pull some of this up. I don't want to throw this on people right off the bat, but you've got some interesting entrepreneurial aspects here. Are you colorblind, first of all?
My father was, but no, I'm not colorblind. Yeah.
So these are some of my Mark Changizi links I've been looking at. You have a Substack with some interesting stuff, really across the board. There's the Václav Havel piece I was mentioning, and they're short pieces, and you're on Facebook as well. This is, I just commented here, what's all the commotion if we can only find out what the common chord is? I mean, kind of referencing Commotio cordis. So that's the Václav Havel piece itself, but you have a homepage here as well, which has your science moment video series, your Substack, and FreeX. So I recommend people go to changizi.com. It's spelled like your name, obviously, and then there's a whole shelf of videos here. This is the deGrasse Tyson one, and then just to kind of carry on, you have a bookshelf on Amazon, and some of these are really fascinating titles. I've not read any of them. I'm not going to pretend, but the vision revolution, um, and people can pause on these if they like to. And I found this one fascinating as a title anyway, How Language and Music Mimic Nature and Transformed Ape to Man. So those are a little bit of teasers. Do you have any comments on follow up on where people should kind of focus their thoughts on you and pursue?
Yeah, I mean, the one that you didn't zoom in on, the most recent one is actually Expressly Human. It's really the origins of emotional expressions, why social
Right.
animals have emotional expressions. And it's sort of a
Sorry about that.
12 years in the making. It's a grand unifying theory for okay, you're bright, you're a social animal, you don't have language, like regular old spoken language. What is this space? What is the kind of emotional expression system that you have to engage in the kind of compromise and negotiation signaling that you have to do? And so you can just derive it from first principles. Here's the language of what it has to be. And in fact, it just works out to a 81 emotional expressions in this sort of four-dimensional space. And you can just sort of see them all. And they're all the ones that you know, and how exactly it works, and how much reputation you're betting whenever you're doing a particular kind of emotional expression, and it all kind of is mathematically beautiful. But also, it's the foundations for free expression itself, because all of the ways that we communicate as a species, we don't communicate as stats people saying, "Oh, but Randall, the thing that I'm saying now has a p-value of 0.00." Oh yeah, I think it has only a p-value of 0.2 and thus not below 0.05. No, the way we do it is by I say, no, I'm really confident. Or do you know who I am? And show that I don't think your claim is very good. You don't know what you're talking about. So I'm showing disdain. Or I can be very respectful, towards you, or I can be humble myself. And these kinds of combinations of these sorts of things and some other things I'm not mentioning lead to how we show confidence levels in what we believe. And the way that we do that is because if I say, do you know who I am? Well, I'm potentially going to be humiliated if I'm wrong. What I've done is I've shoved reputation chips under the table, like in poker. And I've done the same if I say, you don't know what you're talking about, Randall, right? I've also potentially going to lose reputation. So that what makes us believable and what makes good orators believable, that you're willing to follow them and believe them, is because they aren't just saying stuff in a flat affect. They're saying stuff and putting reputation on the line. You're like, holy crap, they put themselves out on a limb. And it's exactly all of that, putting yourself out on a limb through these emotionally expressive intonations or your facial or gestures, whatever it is. Everything that we do is all about that. And none of us are consciously aware of it. We all get it in our bones. And so that what this is the foundations of really how free expression works. But so that's what this book is about. And ironically, for 2 years, I was censored by Twitter, still censored by YouTube and Instagram and Facebook.
Right.
And now we know is by the federal government doing this. And so I was the first First Amendment lawsuit, Michael Sanger, Daniel Kotzen, and myself with the New Civil Liberties Alliance. We were the first suit to come out. We were dismissed. After that, the Missouri and Louisiana district attorney ones had more information, more leaks, more FOIA requests. They've now gone farther. They went to discovery. We have appealed. We've got 7 amicus briefs in our defense, or not
Right.
admitting they're in our defense, but they are really basically
they're co-writers.
Yeah. And so we're hopefully going to do better now on appeal. Yeah.
So just on a personal basis, what's your source of income, if any? How has that changed during COVID? What did your bravery accomplish in your social sphere?
Well, it certainly wrecked the launch of Expressly Human. It's the 6th book, a dozen years in the making. And during the time that it launched last summer, well, I was suspended from Twitter altogether. I mean, well, actually, by then I was back in, but I was treated as sensitive content. So if you went to my page, you just saw this is sensitive content, and most people couldn't even figure out how to get around that. So I was like a porn star status or something like that. And all of you can actually just look at my impressions over time. And then right when Biden was saying, hey, we're going to start censoring, or Jen Psaki, my impressions started to fall. My number of followers leveled out, and then just sort of stayed level for 2 years under sensitive content until Elon Musk finally brought me out of it. So that book, effectively the book was censored, not specifically censored, but if I'm censored and I'm unable,
I get it. No, absolutely.
That book is censored. Yeah.
Yeah. I got booted off LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago with no warning. no strikes, no nothing. It was just one day. I use LinkedIn quite a bit. I enjoy it, but on a total, non-political way, just for business stuff and whatnot. And then they just pulled the rug, and I couldn't even appeal to, because it was like a cruise ship. You showed up 2 hours late to get on your your cruise ship. There's no boat there at all. There was nothing. There was no way of contacting. There's no way to get on. Nothing. And I had to go complain on Twitter, and they answer I guess the squeaky wheel gets greased, and they gave me an appeal place that I hadn't known about, and they had not forwarded to me. And I asked, well, what's up with this? And they said, oh, you're spamming. You're I don't, whatever. It's like, show me an evidence. Give me. I don't. First of all, I don't do that. I'm not the most polite person on earth, but I stop at stop signs and whatnot. I don't go on anybody's LinkedIn profile. I don't say anything.
It wasn't even a COVID or political related claim. They were just claiming you were spammy. They're
Well, what I had been doing was I had been putting videos like this.
yeah,
My content has been pretty much this. I do one or two or a couple of these a week, and the ones that I think are reasonable for business people to hear, I put up there, and that's that. And some of it have been problematic for YouTube and whatnot. I mean, at any rate, you get close to the flame, you get burned a little bit, but but what I only pretty much have smart people, credentialed. Not that credentials matter much anymore, but smart people who make sense, who are analytic and have a lot of data and whatnot to say what they're saying. I don't have anybody coming on and saying that elephants can fly or anything like that. And I don't know. My feeling is that somebody didn't like that content and then said I'm spamming the world, whatever. You get the idea. It's kind
sure.
of like and I've had so many similar occasions to yours where the woman came and yelled at you when you're outside. I was once walking. I walk the dog all the time, and I was walking the dog in the middle of the street during the scariest parts of COVID, and a woman was on the sidewalk. She was a good 12 arms, like breathwise, away from me. Excuse me, 12 feet breathwise, because I was in the middle of a quiet street, and she was on the sidewalk of a quiet street, and she was wearing a mask. I wasn't, and she looked over at me, and she's about probably 68 or whatever, and she just went. She had this terror look, and she just kind of recoiled, and there's a little tiny berm of grass about a half an inch big, and she wound up tripping on that. So she fell over, and I went over to help her up, and she was like, you know, like I was a zombie, and if I touched her, so I'm like, okay, is there anything you'd like me to do? She's like, she couldn't even gasp out like go away, or it was the saddest, most pitiful thing,
Yeah,
and she didn't get hurt. She got up from the grass. She went on, but it is. I mean, if you can't find a bigger metaphor, like a more interesting metaphor for the whole thing, like she's in a world of, you say, I'm going to put you in a world of fear. Well, she was in a world of fear. That was her world. That's her fear, and was it backed up scientifically, data wise? No, and was she an expert on COVID 2 years prior? No, but she was there, and that was real for her. And I'm sure I looked like the Joker and Batman. I mean, it's just crazy.
yeah, yeah. That was the
Uh,
frightening time.
yeah,
And, yeah, it's just in terms of finishing up. I mean, just a lot of people want it just to forget about this and move on, and a lot of people that want to forget about it were drawn in deep and don't really even want to admit to themselves that they were drawn in deep, and they kind of just want to move on. And I think they're getting a little sick of us continuing to talk about it. But I'm wondering if this wasn't the Rwandan genocide. I don't want to say it was, but it was scarier in only this sense that it was worldwide.
yes, I agree. I
That's the
agree.
only sense. I
Yes,
don't want
not to discount any I forget who was getting after who. I guess the Tutsi were going after the Hutu, or the vice versa. At any rate, but not to discount any of those and so forth. And there's horrible things that happen all around. But this was kind of in all the world's happy places. Everyone like, oh, things suck here. I want to go to New Zealand. I want to avoid nuclear apocalypse. I'm going to go to New Zealand. Whatever.
Yeah.
Like, you know what? You can go, but you can't avoid humans. You can't avoid human folly, and that's really sad. I mean, oddly enough, the Faroe Islands did better than the New Zealand islands. I don't know why, but it was a very happenstance arrangement. And I brought this up a number of times, but what I call the cloud within the silver lining within the cloud is that we did the silver lining. We saw flaws in our kind of governmental systems, we think the parliamentary system is all hunky dory, but and obviously within the cloud of COVID, so that was the silver lining. But the cloud within that is that we don't necessarily see any way of changing these things, and the parliamentary system is democracy. But democracy has its problems outside of a constitution, outside of a republic, and you can have the tyranny of the majority, and that's what happened. That you have temporary insanity because you have total party control within the parliamentary system. There's no, the UK and Australia and New Zealand don't have, I don't think, written constitutions. They have this common law, and the common law can be uncommonly stupid from time to time if there isn't any way of abrogating the vagaries of their rulers at any given moment. Anyway, so I'm going to give you a chance to do final thoughts, and I want to bring up my, kind of self-promotional commercial about my book after.
Well, just in terms of the things that may have worked, I'd say the only two things that I have more respect for in terms of governmental structure is, and I have a lot more respect for, is federalism. So just the separation of powers. Each state is not only its own government, but also culturally they're somewhat insulated. They have their own little thing going on. So you can have a collective hysteria going on in a neighboring state and you may be able to avoid it. That kind of 50 little different experiments was, I think, the saving grace in some sense for the United States. The other, and it didn't really save the United States, but still the two-party system, we're stuck in this kind of very polarized two-party system here. And usually we always complain about it, but I think, in March and April, everybody, left, right, and center, especially in March, was all on board and I was so disappointed. This is why I spoke up. I was like, these supposed libertarians, I'm a libertarian. All of them were still saying, no, it's totally good to lock down, and even Masks for Justified Reason magazine was writing pieces, and even the civil liberties, what's this, the ACLU was on the wrong side. If they spoke up at all, they were on the wrong side for 2.5 years, and so finally then they've been on the right side of something, right? Everybody was on the wrong side of it, and left, right, and middle. But still, about a couple months later, the typical left-right polarization kind of reformed again, and you had the right disproportionately anti-lockdown, anti-intervention. And so I think that from my point of view, in March and April, I felt like it was only 3% of the population was on my side, but for free, for no good damned reason, I end up inheriting now 47% of the population who just want to be on my side, because that turns out to be, when it settled out to left, right, they're like, oh, I'm right, and that's the side that ended up on that. So I'm going to take up and say, okay, well, I guess I'm happy to have them for no good reason, because you just need bodies in some sense. So I think that, that might actually be helpful to automatically create an anti-polar to whatever the current collective hysteria is. It sort of splits it into half. Right. You end up with a counterbalance.
Right. Well, there's no better capitalist than those who suffer through communism. I think Winston Churchill said the longest pathway, I'm paraphrasing because he might have been talking about some other topic, but the longest, most difficult, painful, murderous pathway between capitalism and capitalism is communism. And so whether people spanked can get away from that, or whether they have Stockholm syndrome and they start to love their tormentor, I have no idea. But I'm going to leave that there. The other silver lining of the COVID thing is I get to meet people like you. I would not have been doing this video cast. I would not been, doing, frankly, much of this. I had been started the Zika book beforehand, but it would have been the context of the last great pandemic without this one intervening. Anyway, let me just give myself my shameless self-promotion here. This is my book. You collectively, and not necessarily you personally, Mark, but might want to take a look at it. It's called Overturning Zika. I have my picture on the front of the book, as you can see. That's me in the morning. And this is the pandemic that never was. This it's been blotted out, kind of eclipsed, I guess, by coronavirus, all things COVID. But it has it's interesting because you can see it from a distance, the exaggerations and so forth, and so I wrote here, thirst was made for water, inquiry for truth. I think you and I share that. To see as I came, I saw, I conquered Zika, my God, I disappeared, but nobody noticed. So I recommend people buy it. That you can help support my podcast, my work, by doing that. Leave a review, especially if it's a good review. And even if you didn't like it, you can leave a good review. Anyway, I'm just kidding. But thank you so much, Mark. You can hang around and chat for a minute. And we're going to say goodbye to everybody else.